Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today and to talk about one of my favorite topics, um, which is, of course, stemming from my own personal research that I began actually 30 years ago in 1991 at the National Archives when I just out of curiosity wondered, gee, I wonder if I can find Nana in the Choctaw records. I know she's from the Choctaw Nation. She was my great grandmother, and someone had given me a suggestion to look at record group 75 at the National Archives, which I did. And from that trip to the archives in May, excuse me, of 1991, I began an incredible journey. So it's a pleasure to be here to share with you some of the things that I've learned over the last 30 years. And this is not going to be strictly something looking at Oklahoma, because I do know that the rest of the world is not all from Oklahoma. I had a steep learning curve and really had to educate myself about availability of all kinds of records. So I'm happy to share them with you. Let's see here. We're going to talk about this topic from different perspectives. Number one, the questions that arise. Can this really be something that's traced? I know I've heard people say, well, yeah, I've heard that I have some Native American ancestry in my family, but I know I can't prove it. Well, the question arises, can it be traced? Are there really records to be found that will actually reflect a family that might be called a blended family? Is this something that's really traceable? Is it hard to find these records? What are the resources that are out there to document this history? Is there a limitation to what can be found? Of course, as genealogists, we all know that there are limitations. And what are the pitfalls that are there? Well, we're going to address those. So the first question in terms of, can Native American ancestry be traced? And the pictures you're going to see from time to time are pictures from a personal collection. Some of them are from the Perry family that took my family from Mississippi to Indian Territory, and that have been shared with me. And some are pictures of my own family as well. So you might see them interspersed there. But in terms of, can that be addressed? Well, the fact is that yes, this ancestry can be documented with proper documentation and with the standard genealogy methodology that I hope that you all employ. And of course, what are the records? They're the same records that you already use. Vital records, you know what those are: birth, marriage, death. Federal and state census records. Federal records, we know census is conducted every 10 years. And of course, I hope many of you are just as anxious as I am for the beginning of April, because we will have 1950 available to us. Every state did not conduct a state census, so you do need to find out what is unique about your state. Did your state conduct a state census? Some did, some did not. Military records, we use draft cards, we use military service records, we utilize pension records. These are the same records that you're going to use to document Native American ancestry. And of course, there are things that are different. Every county is different, and you want to find out what's on your local level. And that can only be answered by looking to see what's available through your county courthouse. And of course, there are some specialized Indian records that you will be looking at. And let's see here, I'm just making sure things are advancing. Well, we're talking about families that are blended, African Americans who have perhaps ancestry as well with not only other people of African descent, but people of Native American descent as well. Are there any records that show these mixtures? Well, there are some records that show them, but you don't start looking for the mixtures first. You're going to do what you've been taught to do in terms of your basic research. Are the records hard to find? no more difficult than finding the census records, finding the local county courthouse records, and finding what else. They're not hidden, they're not kept from the public, except for the census that's sealed for 72 years and then released. But they're no more difficult to find, which of course we know the numerations can be different, spellings do differ, and we know spelling doesn't always count because many times the people whose data is being recorded, they weren't telling the person writing down the information how to spell it. The person was sometimes guessing. And of course, many people, especially when you get to 19th century records, sometimes our ancestors were not literate, so they didn't know how to spell. And years later, generations later, when their children, grandchildren, etc., are literate, the spelling may differ from what that enumerator wrote in the 1800s. So that's something to always keep in mind. Basic records, census schedules. There are Indian census schedules. I'm going to show some to you. And of course, I've already mentioned the local and regional records. Now, most of you, if you've done genealogy, you know what this is. This is a standard census schedule. That means typically after, I guess after 1850, the schedule started looking something like this, 50 people on a page and information about those individuals, generally in that left column, additional information to the columns to the right. And the columns to the right, we all know, vary from year to year. This is what an Indian census schedule looks like. For 2 census years, 1910 and 1900, the federal government documented Native Americans on a unique census form. Now, with the typical, as we call the standard census schedule, 50 people are on the document. But on the Indian census records, you will see 13th Census of the United States, 1910 Indian population. 25 names appear at the top, and additional information about the same 25 people appear on the bottom half of that page. So we're also going to talk about local regional records. Now, sometimes you'll find information pertaining to an individual who's of Native ancestry, but it's not necessarily going to be tribally specific. It might just say Native. In this case, there's a gentleman who passed away in 1938, Mr. Brayboy. He is from Robeson County, North Carolina. And as you can see, zooming in on that document, color or race, it does indicate that he's of Native ancestry. Now, of course, if you research Robeson County, North Carolina, you might say, oh, well, I know the Native population that's there. But it doesn't say so. It just says Native, or it just says Indian in this case on this document. Now, before going ahead, let's talk about the realities of this whole process. There are going to be limitations to what can be found. Every community was not documented the same way. And I'm going to show you an example of that. And many people think, oh, well, my people were Pamunkey Indians from Virginia, or they're Ojibwe from, another part of the country, or they're whatever nationality one might want to say. So where do I find their tribal roles? Well, first of all, every community doesn't have a specific tribal role. They are creations that the federal government did. Many are in the public domain, and quite a few are on Ancestry of multiple communities. But keep in mind, even today, right now, there are over 560 federally recognized Native American tribes. So that's a lot, and you're not going to find 560 plus communities that are going to have roles for you to go and examine. No, it's not quite like that. Plus, there's some tribes that have changed, some have been absorbed into other nations, and some have blended with other communities and other ethnicities. And sometimes some of those communities don't exist as a freestanding community anymore. So things do change. And of course, some do lose their federal recognition status, which of course is a different discussion. But, and that's why we point out that some communities dramatically changed over the years. For example, even in Oklahoma, which is the one state that has the largest number of federally recognized tribes, 39 different communities federally recognized, all with their tribal headquarters in the state of Oklahoma. But you'll find that some did actually merge with others. For example, the Delawares were adopted by the Cherokees. And so you find, although they are and have been, of course, working to gain their own unique status as a separate federally recognized nation as well. But communities do change over the years. Of course, many of you have probably seen this if you've done research. Some individuals are numerated differently from one document to another. Example, 1880 Census, Robeson County. Remember Mr. Brayboy, whose death certificate we just saw? Look at his designation. In 1880 Census, there's George, there's his wife Rose, and they're listed as mulatto. Now, 20 years later, 1900 Census, there you see him now designated as being of Native ancestry, he and his wife. Now, don't necessarily assume, oh, mulatto means Native or mulatto proves it. No, it does not. There was oftentimes, I guess I'll say, a variation in terms of how people in Native communities were being documented on the census. And here you see in 1880, in this part of North Carolina, this particular person was documented as being mulatto, possibly because he didn't live in a larger Native community. If he had probably moved a few miles over, you'll find an entire community of Native people identified as such. But the fact is that no, mulatto does not mean Native, but clearly it does mean mixed parentage in his case. Mixed with what? We don't really know. And because we don't know Mr. Brayboy's family history. But I do want to point out that that's not what mulatto often means. Of course, we know it doesn't always mean biracial either. But what are the whole steps that are involved with this? Well, of course, first of all, what's your task? I hope that your task in conducting this research is not to prove a race or prove an ethnicity. Hopefully, your task is to document your family and to tell your family's story. I have had many people say, oh, can you help me prove my Native ancestry? And generally, I'm sort of thrown off course by that because now we talk about genealogical proof, but proving that one person is connected to the next person, but that's a step in the greater task, which is to tell your family story. And hopefully that is your goal at all times, to see where the records do take you. Maybe you've heard it and you're curious to see what's going to appear. Very, very important. But it is important to remember your goal should be to tell that story and to document what has happened in the family's story. Now, what's the procedure? Of course, we're talking about blended families. We're talking about African American families. We're talking about Native families. The fact is that you do want to understand what the methods are of both. You want to know what are the basic methods, what are the basic steps, if there are any, for researching African American families. What are the basic methods, if there are, and of course the records for tracing Native American families. And if the family is a blended family, of course you're going to merge those two searches. Now, with African American research, you start with your oral history. Well, actually, everybody should start with their oral history. I don't care what your background is and what part of the world you're from. You've got to ask questions. You ask questions to the family members, to the elders. You want to also start to documenting the family from those available records. Right now, until early April of this year, we have 1840 to start with. Now, we know with many African American families, we go to 1870. However, everyone was not enslaved. So if they were people who were free, then you keep going, of course. But if they were people who may have been enslaved, at least you know from 1940 to 1870 is a beginning. If they were enslaved, you want to identify the last known slaveholder. And that's why I say if applicable, because again, everyone was not enslaved. And once you've identified, and there, that's a task in itself, and that's a workshop in itself. But if you do get to the point where you're able to identify that last known slaveholder, then you begin to research the slaveholder's history. You have got to research that person's family. Number one, how did he or she obtain ownership, quote unquote, of these people who were in bondage? How did this happen? Was this through marriage? Was this through inheritance? Was this through purchase? There are all kinds of ways that people obtained other people as their human chattel. How did that happen? But you're only going to find that out by researching that person's history. If it was through inheritance, perhaps the last slaveholder obtained that inheritance through one of his elders who had passed on enslaved people to them. And of course, the goal of everyone is to document the earliest presence or the arrival of ancestors in America. Everyone has that goal. Now, if you're researching the blended families, one thing is very important. I already mentioned oral history and where to go. One thing is very critical, that third, excuse me, that third button there. Maps, oh my goodness, critical tool. You've got to learn the geography as well as the history of the region where your ancestors lived. So wherever your folks are from, get the state map. If you can obtain a county map, please do so as well. And of course, a map of the town or the community where your family is from. And of course, you want to follow them as well geographically, 20th century as well. What's there now, but what was there? Look, and Google is your friend. You can Google for early maps of whatever state. You can say, do a Google search, early maps, of course, which I've done, Oklahoma early maps, but you can do it for just about every state, and you'd be surprised what is out there. Oral history, let's talk about that. You want to ask the right questions, because you're going to find sometimes you're going to have a great launching pad, and sometimes you may not. And some of the basic questions, when you're talking to an elder, first of all, I always encourage people, and I don't care what kind of research you're doing, but ask that elder, who is the oldest person that they remember? When you're speaking to your favorite aunt or uncle or grandparent, well, grandma, who was the oldest person you remember when you were a child? That's going to at least give you maybe a name. And she might say, well, I remember Aunt Bessie, or I remember Grandma Portia, or whomever. You want to write down everything, because that might point you into the right direction. Who was the ancestor that it's said to have been of Native ancestry? Who was it that you said or that you heard was Native American? Did you know this person? And they might say, oh, yes, I knew them, or no, it was my, great grandmother, but I always heard it. Why was this person said to have been of Native ancestry? What? Okay, well, and hopefully, you're going to get more than a physical description. Well, she had long hair and high cheekbones, which, by the way, do not indicate anything other than the fact that a person's hair was a certain length and they had certain facial features. High cheekbones, well, first of all, I've yet to meet anyone or even see a documentary of anyone with low cheekbones. There's no such thing. There are people in other parts of the world who have prominent cheekbones that some people in America might say are high cheekbones. That is not an indicator of Native ancestry. Ask the question, well, what nation or what tribe was he or she a part of? Sometimes they might say Cherokee, because a lot of times that's a generic term that sometimes people use. But you might hear Blackfoot. Oh my goodness. If your folks are anywhere east of the Mississippi, they're probably not Blackfoot. No, I hear they're Cherokee Blackfoot or Blackfoot Cherokee. I hear that combination all the time. You will never find one document that's going to reflect that. You'll also hear some people, well, that was just a term that was used to reflect some people who were part of the Haliwa Saponi people. Go find the records. You won't find them. Usually people who say that don't have records because there are no records that reflect people with that designation. Blackfoot Nation, sometimes referred to in a plural way, Blackfeet. Montana, Browning, Montana is their base, as well as Southern Alberta province in Canada. The two are the one community is across the two borders, or the one border, but in two different nations. That is the community of Blackfoot Nation. But the question is that hopefully, and this might be a research question more than a question that your elder might be able to answer, but ask it anyway. Was there a community of Native people from a specific group? If somebody says Blackfoot, oh, where was the Blackfoot village? Or was there a community? If they say Cherokee, and it could be because the Cherokee Nation did cover multiple states. North Carolina, certainly part of definitely Eastern Tennessee as well. So, and you find a lot of tribes did overlap in more than one state boundary, what we call now our state boundaries. If there was a community of Native people, did this person, he or she, visit that community? Did others from that community visit her? Did this ancestor speak a language, another language besides English? If so, did you ever learn any of those words, those terms? You know, what was it? What kind of religion did he or she practice? I apologize for that fire truck going down the street. What kind of religion did he or she practice? And did this person, especially if they knew this person, did that person ever speak about their elders? So we want to ask these questions as well. Now let's talk about the census. You want to document the family in the census and explore all possible records. And one of the things I will say, if you find, and of course, for any genealogical process, every census year that they lived through, and we know the census is conducted every 10 years, then you want throughout the span of their life to find individuals in every census year in which they lived. If none of them ever reflect Native ancestry, then you may want to revisit and see if there are other things that are there that might help you to document that, if at all possible. We already know what the standard years are right now that we look at. And with the standard census, I did say back to 1860 because there were some Native communities documented as far back as 1860. Prior to that, the census did not, federal census did not really document on a regular basis Native communities. Now, there were other types of records that you can look at, especially those tribes that were moved to the West. There were immigration rolls that were created before they left and after they arrived in the West. But we're talking right now federal census. And the special Indian census, many of which are on Ancestry. And there's a collection of records on Ancestry. It's called, let's see, Native American Records 1880 to 1945. And of course, federal records 1900 1910, special Indian census. Now, I mentioned geography. It is very important. And I almost want to emphasize this as much as I can. As I said, you know, get the maps as much as you can. The early maps, the current map, you should always have. One of the things you can get right now is a state map where you live right now and where your ancestors are from. You do want to always have one of those. But if you can get a gazetteer that's showing maybe earlier years reflecting in the various communities, definitely want to pay attention to them. Also pay attention to what's available. What is your state archives producing? What is out there to find? And for example, we were looking at Mr. Brayboy from North Carolina, but there are all kinds of things that are there. There's this wonderful state resource, and this is a digitized document. And it's a booklet that one can find that one has been digitized, North Carolina Indians. And in that booklet, it discusses the different communities that were native to North Carolina, even provides a map showing the different communities where some of these nations lived. So you do want to be able to become familiar. Google is your friend. Go to your state archives website, but also just Google early map North Carolina, early map Virginia, early map Tennessee, early map Mississippi, and so on. It's very important. Now, the challenges that are there are some real challenges that you're going to have. Number one, a lot of times, well, she was native. Oh, what tribe? I don't know. You'll hear that a lot. And sometimes the tribal affiliation is just based on somebody's appearance. Well, you know, they had long hair, and I've already mentioned that. That's not research, and that's not necessarily an indicator of what you may think it's indicating. Well, and there are historical limitations. Someone is going to mention, oh, yes, my folks were part of, we were Apache. Oh, really? Where are you from? East Tennessee. Well, that's an oral history that's definitely in contrast to the local history, where you're talking about a native community based in Texas, and it's never ever migrated away from Texas, and probably not in East Tennessee. But there were native people in East Tennessee. Who were they? It's important to pay attention to that. And of course, the reality of slavery, Black chattel slavery, which was also practiced by Native American tribes, 5 tribes in particular. And there was also slavery that involved enslaving Native people as well. And you find people both in not just North America, but also on the islands who were also enslaved, some taken to the Caribbean, numerous islands, and you will find some of them were enslaved as well as Africans being brought in as well. And so it's a complicated story. Of course, we know American history is a complicated story as well, but these are real challenges that you're going to have. Also, there's some real limitations. Guess what? Some information is not always accurate. Some information, as I already said, conflicts with documented local history. Some elders are repeating words that they heard as a child that could have been misinterpreted. I can give you an example of that. I remember that I heard another person say they had always thought that they were Native American. And in fact, what did I say? Blackfoot. They were always told, oh yeah, you know, we part Blackfoot Indian. And what had happened is that a person did ask one of the elders in the family, well, who was our Blackfoot Indian ancestor? And the person looked at them, why do you think we have that in our ancestry? Because remember, every time I was visiting Nana, she would always say, here comes my little Blackfoot Indian. And the person who was asking their parent this question said, oh my gosh, again, this is what a child heard and misinterpreted, and said, your grandma was always teasing you because you were always going outside without shoes and your feet were always black on the bottom because you'd been running around with no shoes. And that was her statement. Here comes my little Blackfoot Indian. We don't have Blackfoot Indian in our line. And this was something that this person was just stunned, but they had heard something as a child, had misinterpreted, didn't realize it was a quote unquote joke. But it was something that this person heard, had assumed was correct. And again, some people base ancestors on racial features. And most importantly, that issue of racial features. Sometimes people are spoken of as being native to avoid association with another racial group. Example, there are some individuals who will see the light-skinned ancestor a little bit lighter skinned than everyone else and say, oh, look, you can tell, yep, she's Indian, although there was no native community nearby. And what's the elephant in the room? Slavery. And what did slavery bring about? Slavery brought about racially mixing that was not always consensual, producing mixed offspring. And of course, racism, we know, certainly is there, and that fear of other. Also, in families that are not African ancestry, that picture of the family in 1895, and there was someone who was a little bit darker. Oh, they're Indian. That's why they're kind of darker skinned. When really that person may have had some African ancestry. So this is something that can be a limitation. Is it across the board in every family? No, absolutely not. Here's an example of a blended family. You see the woman seated in the chair. This is Eliza Perry Sexton. Woman was full Choctaw, spoke no English. Her daughter is standing up on the right. The daughter's daughter is standing on the left, holding the child. And as you can see, the children are blonde-haired children. This is a blended family. And this is part of the Choctaw family that brought my ancestors from Mississippi, Yalobusha, into Indian Territory, enslaved. But this is that family. Now, enumerations can be different. I'm sure many of you have seen in one census year, just like we saw with Mr. Brayboy. He was mulatto one year, but then he's native for the rest of his life in the census. And sometimes you'll see, especially with African American research, you'll see mulatto, you'll see Black. Of course, as the 20th century rolls by, you start to see colored or Negro as well. But you also see some families that chose to disassociate from one group, and that may happen. Those who have ancestors, we've heard, you were all familiar with the term passing, and people who passed into another identity, and that certainly has happened. And so you see them in later years, not identified a certain way. But again, another limitation, I already mentioned, not every community had tribal roles. Not all records are available for outsiders to come in and examine. Oh, let me go and see what's in this Iroquois community. You have any records for me to come and look at? Well, it's not necessarily something for you to come and examine, but there are records. And of course, we know that census enumerators didn't always do their job the same way. I'm sure you've seen a census page, or at least I know I have, where I'm on a roll and I'm excited, I'm getting to the right county, and I get to the census page and it's full of people, but the enumerator just decided to write down their initials and not their given names. So you'll see that as well. So things can be challenging, but you'll see in some communities, the enumerator was not that thorough. Now, of course, as I already said, there's certain facts regarding free people, white, Black, and Native as well. With African American families, you're going to find people were enslaved and many people were free. Native American, some were moved to the West, but there are plenty who never were moved to the West and who are still on the East, and those communities are alive and well to this day. In the white community, you also had early traders and hunters who married into Indian communities. And also you had Black chattel slavery and many owners, overseers, and relatives of the owners and overseers who had access to women of color, thus producing mixed offspring. So this is just, that's the reality. Now, what is there to find? Now, this is just a smattering. I'm not even scratching the surface. I've already mentioned the Special Indian Census. Many people hear about the Guillain Miller rolls. This is from multiple states. So I'm not just focusing on Oklahoma. Multiple states, 90,000 files. Do you see how large that is? Dawes rolls. Now, I know I've had people reach out to me. Oh, I found my people on the Dawes rolls. But then turns out that they're from Georgia. Well, they're not on the Dawes roll. It is strictly Oklahoma, Indian Territory, and I think they went out to Oklahoma. Yes, but to be on the Dawes roll, you had to prove that you'd been there consecutively from every decade onward, from the 1830s onward to the time the Dawes rolls were created in 1898. and closed in 1914. But 14,000 files, it's a lot of people. For Oklahoma, there are a lot of records that predated 1898, and plenty of those, and I'm in those records every day as well. Now, when you're looking at the census, you're going to look at three types. You're going to look at Indian communities, you're going to look at mixed communities, and mixed families. Indian communities, that means just about everybody on that page or in that set of pages, everybody were people designated as Indian or Native American, and they are a distinct community in those records, and you know it when you see that. Mixed communities, you will see people who are white, black, native, all on the same page. And then within one of those pages, you'll see families where somebody's native, someone is not, and you'll see examples of those. Now, in an Indian community, just about everyone on the page is enumerated as being Indian. And I'm using the term Indian as opposed to Native American because that's the way they're reflected on the census. Let's take a look at New York, Suffolk County, Brookhaven. Those of you who know New York, and I know many of you are from the New York area today, you know that is Long Island. Well, this is 1870. Look at this Native community. You see people here, column number 6. You see the abbreviation IND for everyone. Everyone was enumerated as being of Native ancestry. You also see something written over there on the left in the margin. As I rotate that, you see it's Indian or IND, living upon reservation. And we're talking Suffolk County. This is Long Island. I'm going to come back to that community shortly. A mixed community, you're going to see people who are white on the census, black, what have you. And in this case, you see also not only a mixed community, but also a mixed family. You see Jesse Jones, you see a woman called Mary, and then of course, this is still 1870, by the way, and you see a woman called Jenny Ordway. And you see a household, Jesse is clearly indicated as Indian. There is also Mary and there is Jenny, and they were indicated as being black. This is 1870. Now, this family, I'm zooming out, this is the same page. This is Giles County, Tennessee. And of course, we see this mixed family. But take a look, you see where that red arrow is at the bottom. Zooming in, look at what it says. One male Indian counted as colored, which was kind of interesting to see that. And I was thinking, okay, well, why is this notation here? Well, the answer to that question is right up above that line. You see they had to tabulate the population at the bottom of each page. Number of dwellings, number of white males, white females, colored males, colored females. Of all the people on the page, one colored male, but you see the notation. One male Indian counted as colored because they knew that he was not white. So, and there's nothing, you see number of males and females and who are blind, but there's no indication of number of Indians. So that's why that was indicated. That's why he put that note there, the enumerator. Now, were the enumerations found regularly? Well, there was no pattern, to be honest, and it can be frustrating, but I always encourage people, this is where your local history is critical. You want to know, well, where did the Native communities actually live? And wherever they were, what county, what township, wherever it may have been, you really want to zoom in on those. And of course, sometimes they're indicated as Indian and sometimes they're not. So let's go back to Jesse. Here they are, a mixed family. Somebody Indian, he's 60, she's 28. Interesting. And of course, there's Jenny. And this is 1870. 1880, look at this. Here is Jesse. Here's Mary. Now, Jenny's already married and moved away. But wow. And here we are, Jesse and Mary. And now you see they are head of the household and spouse and wife. So you know it's the same person, which is very, very interesting to see that. And again, as I said, this is why it's so important to document individuals throughout every census year in which they lived. And if there is some native identity that the person has, hopefully in one of those census years, it will be reflected, and sometimes more than one. But there's another challenge. Let's go down to Lake Charles, Louisiana. As I said, census enumerators, they didn't always list the communities the same way. Look at this, Lake Charles, Louisiana, 1870. Again, you see a man called Baptiste. You see he had children, a daughter, a boy, and another boy. I'm sure they had names, but the enumerator just, well, what's the head of the house? And okay, he's got 4 kids, one daughter, and 3 sons. Okay. And then right close by is Jacob and his wife Lucy. Oh, and they have a daughter and another daughter. Wait a minute. You realize, okay, this enumerator did not get everyone's name. Of course, that column, you see the capital I indicating the race. And down the page, you see the ditto mark. Now, you want to examine the record closely. As you look at it, this is the top of that same page. Zooming out a little bit, you see it says inhabitants in. It doesn't even tell you where, except we know that this is in the Lake Charles area because you see the post office there. But it's not telling you what this township was. And it's clearly pointing out this is in Kalispell Parish in Louisiana. But look at column 10, which should be the place of birth. The enumerator's like, I don't care where they're born, what's their tribe? And you see Alabama, but what he's actually saying that he's from a tribe, the Alabama tribe. And you see that ditto mark there. And then you see Jacob, who was Coshada. And you start to see other things that the enumerator did. Column number 7, which was a profession, their occupation, their trade. Well, it just says farmers. And as I say, examine the record in its entirety. And I'm going to go down that page. Okay, you see where it says farmers living at the Indian village on the east bank of the Kalispell River. We're going down the page, above Thompson's Bluff, and following the occupation of hunters and farmers at Prairie Tolabo. Oh my goodness, where did they live? All you know is that they lived at the Indian village on the east bank of the Kalispell River above Thompson's Bluff. Now, this is where your geography will help you. You get an old map or an old gazetteer, you might actually find, once you locate the river, you might find an old map that might show you where Thompson's Bluff was located, because you can't quite get it from this particular census schedule. And of course, you look over to the right where, in terms of what tribes they belong to, you'll see some of the others on that page. Someone was Muskogee, another Coshada, another Alabama, and Coshada, and so on. So you see that the enumerators didn't always document people in a native community the same way. But you get a map, look at the Kalispell River. Okay, it starts in the middle of Louisiana and goes all the way to the Gulf. But Lake Charles, Louisiana is near the Gulf. So somewhere in that southern part of that river, you might find Thompson's Bluff. If you get the right maps, that might reflect that. So you do want to study that, but it can be challenging. Now, let's go back to the 20th century record, standard census record, special Indian census. You know what this is, standard, typical census record. Now, this is an Indian census record, 1900, 1910. And the standard records, it's typically 50 people on a page. People appear, the names are to the left going down the page, and then subsequent information, additional information appear in those columns to the right. Indian census, 1910 Indian population. It's 25 people at the top, some space, and then additional information about the 25 people at the top of the page. Now, here's a blank form to show you what that bottom half of that page. You know what the top half is. It's their name, the relationship, their gender, their race, their age, marital status, etc., birthplace, and standard information. The bottom tells you the tribe of that person, the tribe of their father, the tribe of their mother. And then look at this proportion of Indian and other blood. Indian, white, Negro. And again, keep in mind, there's no scientific method. So the enumerator was just guessing. Number of times married. That could be interesting. Whether living in polygamy. Look at column number 40. Number 41, if they're living in polygamy, were the wives sisters? Interesting question. And in some communities, maybe that was something to capture. I do wish the regular census schedules contained the data from column 42. Graduated from what educational institution? I wish that that was on every census schedule, but it's not. Is this person taxed? Have they gotten allotments? And if so, what year? And in terms of the residents, are they living on their own land? Are they living on quote unquote tribal land or what? And then, of course, which just floors me with the language that was used, are they living in civilized? Yeah, they put it there. Civilized or aboriginal dwelling. In 1900, I think they used movable dwelling, but yeah, they used that term. Here is the 1910 Special Indian Census. Again, information, other name, if that person had a name that was different, maybe a traditional name, the tribe of their father, the tribe of the person, their father, their mother. But interestingly, with their mixed ancestry in 1910, remember they wanted to know what kind of other blood the person had, whether it's Indian or white or Negro. In 1900, they just want to know, does this person have any white blood? And if so, how much? As if one can measure blood. And of course, their conjugal condition, is this person married? Are they living, as a single couple? Or are they living in a polygamous relationship, which is so interesting that they document it that way. Is this person taxed? Are they citizens? If so, when? And that was because in certain communities where people had been removed to the West, parts of the treaty, for example, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit in 1829 allowed Choctaws in Mississippi, if you want to stay, you must become a citizen if you do not wish to migrate to the West. Now, other tribes were removed more forcibly and didn't have much choice, but still, that's why you see that question that's there. And dwelling, is this person living in a fixed or movable dwelling? So you do see that sort of thing. Now, I'm going to give you an example, case study. These are my great-grandparents, Sam and Sally Walton. They're from the Choctaw Nation. And Sally's grandmother went west, was taken as an enslaved woman from Yalabusha into the Choctaw Nation, into Scullyville, where my great-grandmother was born. And that's her husband, my great-grandfather, Sam. The family was documented in 1900. Now, they were designated as Choctaw freedmen because they had been freed from enslavement in 1866. In 1900, they appear as a Black family. There's Sam, great-grandpa Sam, my great-grandmother Sally, Uncle Houston, my grandfather Sam, and my great-grandmother's brother, Uncle Joe. There he is there as well, living with them. 1910, they suddenly appear no longer on the standard census schedule. Now they appear on the Special Indian Census, 1910. They are listed at the top of the page, Sam, Sally, and Sam Jr. Uncle Houston had died in an accident, and Uncle Joe had moved away. So it's now the three of them appearing in the 1910 census. So let's take a look at it. You see them there, the first three people at the top, which means the first three people at the bottom half, there's information about them. And you zoom in, lines 1, 2, and 3. See, tribe of this Indian, tribe of the father, tribe of the mother. Sam was the one at first at the top. First, you see Cherokee, then you see Negro M, which I'm assuming is for male. But then you see his father's Cherokee, his mother's Black, his mother's Negro. So the proportion of Indian and other blood, one half Indian, one half Negro. Sally, again, you see Choctaw. Her father's Choctaw, her mother is Negro. But suddenly the math gets interesting. She's suddenly 1/4 Indian, 3/4 Negro. And Grandpa Sam, the mathematics gets very interesting. He's 3/8 and 5/8. You do know that this cannot be measured, and there was nothing scientific about this. This is an opinion of a person who was just told, eyeball it. What do they look like? And a lot of people have looked at this. No, I know they were more than that. It's like, chill out. First of all, the record's over 100 years old. And it was just, if you read the instructions, there were instructions given to the enumerator. They made that designation. And if anything, I just sort of shake my head and just say, oh my goodness, wow, okay. But they're there. What is most significant is that you do see these. And this document, the Special Indian Census of 1910, is in multiple states. Here's one, 1878, 1910. Again, this is New York. And you see this population on this document. And guess what? The Shinnecock community in New York. And you see everyone is Shinnecock. And you see that this is a blended community. You see everyone is 1/2 Indian, 1/2 Negro on that particular document. And again, it didn't mean that people didn't intermarry and, years later, of course they did. Communities change. Upstate New York, Seneca Indians, just about everybody in the bottom half is strictly Native ancestry. As you can see, almost everyone is full and unmixed with any other community. But let's go down to Virginia. Here's Charles City, Virginia. And you see a fascinating community in Charles City, Virginia. Everyone's from Virginia. As we zoom in and we see everyone is listed there at the top. And column 6, everyone is listed as being Native ancestry. And everyone is Chickahominy here. But look at the proportion of Indian and other blood. It's very much a triracial community. And I always tell people, don't get upset with those fractions. It's just the opinion of the person who was collecting the data. This document so far I have found in those states. And as you can see, from the Carolinas, New York, New Jersey, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Connecticut. There are other states, I'm sure. I've just not looked at every single state, but you do find it in multiple states. So you do want to review the records. You want to, of course, take in those vital records: birth, marriage, death, federal census, military. We're going to talk about military. And of course, whatever the local courthouse records are there before you move on to specialized records and tribal rolls. I know people who want to immediately jump and see if they can find someone on the Dawes roll. But the Dawes roll, if your folks are from North Carolina, they're not on the Dawes roll. I mentioned military. Here's a man, Edmund Grayson. What's interesting in his particular case, too, you'll see the lower left-hand corner snipped off, which is typically done for individuals who were of African ancestry. In that there were several drafts. There were 3, I believe, in 1917. That first one, they had to snip it. They sort of flagged people who had African ancestry. Well, Edmund Grayson, first of all, if I know this man is Grayson, and he's from Oklahoma, Oklahoma, I know Oklahoma. I've been to Oklahoma multiple times, from childhood to adulthood. That's a Creek community, Creek Nation community. And sure enough, down at the bottom, line 10, you see with the race, he was married and he was Indian. I can assure you he was Creek. Muskogee Creek Nation is right there, headquarters in Okmulgee, but that area is part of the old Creek Nation. And so you see, though, he's on a draft card as well, because Native Americans were definitely drafted for World War I. You've heard of some of the code talkers from both world wars, and there were some also from Native communities. But also you find people who came from African Americans who came from Native communities. You have those from, I said USCTs and IHG. IHG means Indian Home Guards. They were part of a community that went into Kansas. And with Chief Opataleahola, they were trying to get out of the way of the Civil War from Indian Territory. Once they got to Kansas, some joined the Indian Home Guards. Many joined the 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored that later became redesignated as the 79th and 83rd U.S. Colored Troops. You see Quash McGilvery, and you look where he was born, in the Creek Nation, and Amos Adair, and you look at him, where was he from? The Cherokee Nation. So you do find records that are reflecting people who came out of Native communities. Now, there are some records that are very specialized. Guillain Miller rolls, reflecting records of the Eastern Cherokee, and the Dawes rolls, which I have to emphasize again, is Oklahoma, reflecting Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations. There are 3 types of records you're going to find: enrollment cards, interview packets, and the final rolls. But they're waiting for you, but after you've exhausted the census and other vital records. Now, there's the Guillain Miller Index. Now, first of all, what's a Guillain Miller? Guillain Miller was a special agent. He worked for the federal government. And what had happened in the early 20th century, the Cherokee Nation sued the United States government for the lands that they lost during the forced migration to the West, the Trail of Tears. They won their case, and it was decided that, well, okay, we will repay people if they can prove that they're of Native ancestry and of Cherokee ancestry specifically. And if they could prove it, that they would be entitled to a one-time payment, every person who could prove it, of $133, which you might say, oh, that's it. But this is going to everyone. So if you're in a family of 10 people, that can be a lot of money at the early 20th century. But guess what? People from all over the country applied. People from New York to Texas, and look at the column, the state. And if you just run your eye down that column, you see Georgia, Oklahoma, IT, of course, Indian Territory, Tennessee. People were applying from North Carolina, from Missouri, from Texas, Minnesota, Kansas. You'll see them from literally all over the country who are applying. There are thousands of files, and you see where the names are. To the left, you see some numbers. Those numbers are their file numbers. So for every name, there is a file, there's an application. Now, the index itself, 345 pages. 345 pages. And these are all on archives.gov. You can see the Guillain Miller Index. It's all been fully digitized for you. Now, and I will say that the Eastern Cherokee applications are on Fold 3, and I believe they're also on Ancestry. I usually go to Fold 3 because I can just sort of manipulate them faster, but they're also on Ancestry. The Dawes roll, and of course, as I said, it's primarily Oklahoma. The records are categorized as by blood, freedmen, intermarried whites, newborns, and minors. They consist of cards, jackets, which are the interviews, and then the final roll, and reflecting these 5 tribes. This is what a Dawes card blood roll looks like. It's a one-sided card. You see information about the person, their age, their gender, their blood, whether it's full. Notice in this case, Molly McDaniel, her husband, Leonidas is full. You see Molly, his wife, IW, intermarried white. They lived in Doberg, Indian Territory, in the Chickasaw Nation. And you see other information. If they were on any earlier tribal roll, you see that. The name of the father of each person. So you follow Leonidas, the head of that house, and follow it over to the right. You see a column, name of the father of that person. And from, if they were listed on another district roll, you'll see that. And the name of the mother is there. And the same way with Molly as well. Freedmen cards are double-sided. You see, this person lived in Dewey in the Kewaskum district in the Cherokee Nation. You see William Weber's 51, and you see his age, you see his gender. It says year, meaning was he documented earlier. KC means Kern Clifton roll. That roll is also digitized, and you can find that also on Ancestry. He lived in the Kewaskum district. He was a slave of Robert Weber. So this man from the Cherokee Nation had been enslaved by Cherokee Robert Weber. And it says at the bottom, there's a notation that he's on the Wallace roll. And what page on the Wallace roll? And you'll see that they had written his name as WM as opposed to writing it fully as William Weber. And so it's telling you, and he had been granted, this was all for a process to receive a land allotment. The back side of the card is more information. The name of his father. Take a look. Who was his slaveholder? Robert Weber. Who was his father? Robert Weber. And you see under tribal enrollment, his father was Cherokee. His mother, Lucinda French from the Kewaskum district, and his mother was enslaved by Robert Weber. So you find numerous freedmen cards. They're all double-sided. Now, of course, you are advised use all your standard records first, and the records are often specific to a certain geographic region. Sometimes they're limited in the data that's provided, especially if remembering that community in Lake Charles, obviously some information was not collected and it was just sort of lumped together. So sometimes there is a limitation. And of course, rolls are not the only method of documenting a family or a family's Native American ancestry. And most families that are on rolls like the Guillain Miller roll or other rolls, they're also on the federal census. So don't assume that, oh, I found them over here in this roll. Well, they should also be in the census. They were in the community. And so you do want to most definitely keep that in mind. So let's see here. Now, I had mentioned learning the geography and history where your ancestors lived. I just want to emphasize this again and again and again. Start getting some maps. They should be in your arsenal anyway. But I do want to also, well, number one, encourage you to also connect with the historical groups that are reflecting that community. If there's a historical society that's reflective of your ancestral community, think about joining that historical society as well. But then also just some final suggestions. I want you to avoid some pitfalls. First things first, use what you already know is there. And I know a lot of people, well, what about DNA? I see I have 2% Native ancestry. That's nice. But that 2% Native ancestry is not necessarily going to help you find the Native ancestor. You want to do your due diligence. And first things first, start to practice standard genealogy research. Indian records should also not be your first stop, and DNA is not going to be a shortcut. I do encourage you to follow the trail of names. Avoid the search for gold. Many people come to me, I want to get an Indian scholarship for my child. And can you help me find my Indian ancestor? And it's like, wait a minute. So you want to get a scholarship or expect that there's a financial gain that will help you. Hopefully that is not what's going to be what is driving your research. Your research should be certainly done objectively and with a standard methodological approach to take you where you need to go. Keep the focus on your records, not on the physical features. Don't worry about those high cheekbones. They're not going to define what you're hoping to find. And also call your ancestors what they were. If you know the name of the community and you know that your ancestors had ties to that community, then you really want to be able to refer to them by that name. It is very, very important. And always maintain the integrity of your research. Avoid invention. You don't want to, well, maybe, and I've heard people say this, well, maybe they, because especially if families have only found their family indicated as being an African American family. Well, maybe they decided to list themselves as Black because it was so hard being Native. Well, it's also hard being Black in this country, many challenges. So you don't want to invent a story that you don't know is the story. So it is very important that we walk in truth and speak to that truth. I leave you with the words of some of the elders from not necessarily my family, but from my part of the country. These are from interviews taken in the 1930s. Mary Grayson was a Creek freed woman, and she was interviewed as part of the Indian Pioneer Papers, a project that began in Oklahoma. The same time the WPA slave narratives occurred. And she said, I'm what colored people around here call a native. That means I didn't come into Indian country from somewhere in the old South after the war, like so many Negroes did. But I was born here in the old Creek Nation, and my master was Creek Indian. That was 83 years ago, so I'm told. Henry Batiste, the Choctaw freedman. There was a bunch of us Negroes who lived on about 12 miles from the Antlers near what's called Beaver Creek. What Negroes that live out there are mostly Choctaw freedmen who allotted land in that part of the country. There used to be a good many Negroes there, but they've all died out, and there are just a few left to tell the tale. Sarah Wilson says it best. I was a Cherokee slave, and now I'm a Cherokee freed woman. And besides that, I'm a quarter Cherokee my own self. This is the way it is. This is the way it is. I thank you for your time. And as my great-grandmother Sally, whom I did know when I was a child, Yakoke, which is thank you so much. I'll be happy to take any questions that might be there. And thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Are there any questions that are out there